For 30 years, while a billion lives were pulsing outside these walls, time in this specific Kolkata care facility remained frozen. Since 1995, Shekhar Radhakrishna had existed in a state of absolute, unmoving stasis. His return wasn't a sudden cinematic miracle, it was a biological tide. Over 2 years, neural activity began to build in regions of his brain that had been quiet for 3 decades. It was a shift measured in millimeters and months, too slow to see in real time, but relentless in its progression. That multi-year build finally hit a breaking point. At 6:14 a.m. on February 17, 2025, the hospital monitors registered a sustained breach of consciousness. The 30-year silence was over. The hospital called Shekhar's wife, Sita, immediately. She answered on the first ring. There was no panicked confusion on the line, only the calm, focused readiness of a person who had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this conversation. Sita had visited this room on the second Thursday of every single month for 360 months. Between those visits, she raised their son and taught her mathematics students, maintaining a household that functioned as a permanent placeholder for a missing man. The awakening wasn't an interruption of the family's life. It was the final, logical result of a decades-long maintenance project. At 9:47 a.m., beneath the flat gray light of a February morning, Shekhar opened his eyes. The room was heavy with a silence that didn't feel empty, but populated by the weight of 3 decades. Sita sat in her usual chair, wearing the blue kurta she'd worn to the hospital 100 times before. She didn't move to explain the missing years. She simply sat as she always had, the primary anchor to a world he no longer recognized. He turned his head and saw her. In a voice that had not been used in 30 years, he spoke her name. She reached forward and took his hand, choosing a shared silence over the impossibility of a spoken explanation. 20 minutes later, a younger man arrived. He stopped at the threshold of the room, pausing with a characteristic hesitation before entering. Shekhar had never met his son. They occupied the silence together, using their presence to support a man who had effectively traveled through time. In that single room, 30 years of history were compressed into the simple, shared act of being present. The recovery that followed was a slow process of translation. Shekhar was a man from 1995 being asked to inhabit 2025, a journey across an immense mental landscape of cultural and technological shifts. He asked about NovaBridge, the company he and Kiran had built. He had to absorb the fact that the business was gone, dissolved decades ago after the global markets collapsed in 2001. Kiran explained how they had closed. They had settled every debt, they had looked after every employee. Even in the middle of a collapse, they had delivered on every promise they ever made. Shekhar looked at the ceiling and processed the loss of his work. He offered no resentment, only a final, unclouded conclusion. Then it was enough. But while the company was gone, Kiran had spent 6 years on a different project. He had fought a quiet, expensive legal battle to reclaim a stone farmhouse on a hillside in the Northeast. It was a mission he had kept secret, funded by 3 decades of hope. Kiran finally showed him a photograph. It was a view of a glacial lake and a stone house waiting in the mist. This was the piece of evidence that finally grounded Shekhar in the present. Shekhar spoke his first clear, unfragmented sentence since 1995. He looked at the image and said, "That's home." Lost time cannot be retrieved, but 3 decades of constant devotion turn a hospital room into a destination. It creates a space where a person can finally wake up and instantly recognize where they belong.